Marcus' chin pressed his back against the cold metal of the school locker, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of the abandoned hallway. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak began, and Millbrook High School had become an unlikely fortress for the 17 survivors who called it home. The irony wasn't lost on him that the place where he'd once struggled through chemistry class was now where he fought for his very existence. Outside, the moans of the undead created a constant, haunting soundtrack that had replaced the usual sounds of teenage life. Marcus gripped his makeshift weapon, a fire axe he'd taken from the emergency case, and listened intently to the shuffling footsteps echoing from the cafeteria below. Something was different about tonight's attack. The zombies seemed more organized, more purposeful in their movements, as if they were being guided by some unseen intelligence. Sarah Williams, the former head cheerleader who had transformed into their group's strategic leader, crouched beside the window overlooking the school's main courtyard. Her blonde hair was now cropped short and practical, and her once pristine manicured nails were broken and dirty from weeks of survival. Through the reinforced glass, she could see dozens of the infected gathering in formations that defied everything they thought they knew about zombie behavior. These weren't the mindless shambling corpses they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These creatures moved with purpose, some even carrying crude weapons they'd fashioned from debris. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "we need to get everyone to the gymnasium. Now." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had watched too many friends die and refused to lose anyone else under her watch. The transformation of their group from frightened teenagers into hardened survivors had been brutal and swift. Tommy Rodriguez, once the class clown who could barely handle a pop quiz, now served as their scout and reconnaissance expert. His intimate knowledge of the school's layout, gained from years of sneaking around to avoid detention, had proven invaluable in creating escape routes and hidden passages. Elena Vasquez, the quiet girl from AP Biology, had become their medic and scientist, using her knowledge to understand the infection and treat injuries with limited supplies. Even Jake Morrison, the former star quarterback who had initially refused to take orders from anyone, had learned to follow Sarah's leadership after witnessing her save 3 people during a particularly vicious zombie attack in the library. The school building itself told the story of their survival. Barricaded windows revealed glimpses of the hell that waited outside, where abandoned cars sat like metal tombstones in the parking lot, their doors hanging open from when their owners had fled in panic. The hallways, once filled with the chaos of teenage life, now bore the scars of desperate battles, bloodstains on the walls, broken glass from shattered trophy cases, and makeshift weapons scattered where they'd been dropped during hasty retreats. The cafeteria had been transformed into a workshop where they crafted weapons and reinforced their defenses, while the library served as their planning room, its tables covered with hand-drawn maps of the surrounding area and notes about zombie movement patterns. Their daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of survival. Morning patrols to check the perimeter, afternoon scavenging missions to nearby buildings for supplies, and evening strategy sessions where they planned their next moves. They'd learned to move silently through the corridors, communicating through hand signals and staying alert for the slightest sound that might indicate a breach in their defenses. The zombies had tested their barriers repeatedly, and each attack had taught them something new about their enemy's capabilities and weaknesses. But tonight felt different. The coordinated movement outside suggested an intelligence behind the assault that terrified them more than any mindless horde ever could. As Marcus made his way through the darkened hallways toward the gymnasium, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted by something far more dangerous than they'd ever faced. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and every creak of the building made him pause and listen. Behind him, he could hear the other survivors moving quietly through their predetermined routes, each person knowing their role in the evacuation plan they'd drilled dozens of times. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the main entrance, followed by the unmistakable groan of metal being bent and torn. Their barricades were failing faster than ever before, and the systematic way the zombies were dismantling their defenses suggested they were dealing with an evolved threat. As Marcus reached the gymnasium doors, he turned back for one last look at the school that had sheltered them for 3 weeks. Tomorrow they would have to venture into the unknown world beyond these walls, leaving behind the only safety they'd known since the outbreak began. The real test of their survival was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets as Marcus led the group of 17 survivors through the maze of overturned cars and debris that had once been downtown Millbrook. Their escape from the high school had been harrowing, with Sarah still recovering from a deep gash on her arm from broken glass during their midnight evacuation. The coordinated zombie attack had shattered their sense of security, forcing them to abandon the only home they'd known since the outbreak began. Now, trudging through the eerily quiet city with their meager supplies strapped to their backs, they faced the terrifying reality that nowhere was truly safe anymore. Tommy Rodriguez crouched beside a storm drain grate, his practiced eye scanning the metal bars for any signs of recent disturbance. During their final days at the school, he'd spent hours studying the city's infrastructure maps in the library, memorizing every tunnel, sewer line, and underground passage that might offer shelter. His fingers traced the edges of the grate, noting fresh scratches in the metal that suggested recent human activity. "Someone's been here," he whispered to Marcus, his voice barely audible over the distant groaning of zombies several blocks away. The discovery sent a ripple of hope through the exhausted group. If other survivors were using the underground passages, it might mean they'd found a way to stay hidden from the evolving zombie threat. The descent into the storm drain system was treacherous, with Elena Vasquez using her medical knowledge to help the injured navigate the slippery concrete surfaces. The tunnels were darker than any nightmare, their flashlights creating dancing shadows that made every corner seem to hide potential threats. Jake Morrison, despite his earlier reluctance to follow anyone's orders, had become their unofficial rear guard, constantly checking behind them for signs of pursuit. The smell of stagnant water and decay filled their nostrils, but it was preferable to the rotting stench of the zombie hordes above ground. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine passages, they encountered their first sign of organized human presence. A series of chalk marks on the tunnel walls that formed a crude but systematic code. Sarah, despite her injury, took the lead in deciphering the symbols, her strategic mind working to understand the pattern. The marks led them deeper into the system, past abandoned maintenance areas and forgotten storage rooms, until they reached a section where the tunnel walls showed signs of recent reinforcement and the floor had been cleared of debris. The challenge came when they reached a checkpoint, a heavily barricaded section of tunnel guarded by 3 armed survivors who emerged from hidden positions with military precision. The leader, a weathered woman in her 50s wearing tattered CDC identification, introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Kane. Her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much death and carried too many secrets. Behind her, 2 younger men kept their weapons trained on the newcomers while Dr. Kane questioned them about their origins, their encounters with the infected, and most importantly, whether anyone in their group had been bitten. Dr. Kane's revelation about the infection's true nature sent shockwaves through the group. The zombie plague wasn't a natural virus or bacterial infection. It was the result of a classified government experiment called Project Lazarus, designed to create enhanced soldiers who could survive fatal injuries. The experiment had gone catastrophically wrong when the test subjects retained their aggressive instincts but lost their higher cognitive functions. The knowledge that their nightmare had been created by human ambition rather than natural disaster added a new layer of betrayal to their already fragile trust in authority. The journey to the main tunnel community was a revelation in itself. The abandoned subway system had been transformed into a sprawling underground city, complete with sleeping quarters carved into maintenance alcoves, workshops fashioned from old subway cars, and a central gathering area where over 200 survivors had created a functioning society. Solar panels jury-rigged to surface grates provided limited electricity, while water was collected from various sources and purified through improvised filtration systems. The ingenuity of the survivors was impressive, but Dr. Kane's warnings about their dwindling supplies cast a shadow over their achievement. Colonel James "Iron" Patterson, the tunnel community's leader, embodied the harsh realities of their new world. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, and his military bearing commanded respect from the diverse group of survivors under his protection. However, his initial assessment of Marcus and his friends as dead weight created immediate tension. The teenagers had proven themselves capable of survival, but Patterson demanded they prove their worth to a community that couldn't afford to support anyone who couldn't contribute to their collective defense and resource gathering. The part concluded with a chilling discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their enemy. A returning scout team reported observing zombies using crude tools to break through barriers and displaying pack-hunting behavior that suggested retained problem-solving abilities. The infection was evolving, and the mindless shambling corpses they'd learned to fight were becoming something far more dangerous. As Marcus looked around at the faces of the tunnel community, he realized they were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the future of human civilization itself. The pre-dawn darkness of the tunnel community buzzed with nervous energy as Marcus checked his makeshift armor one final time. 3 days had passed since Colonel Patterson's ultimatum: prove their worth or face expulsion from the underground sanctuary. The mission parameters were brutally simple: infiltrate Millbrook General Hospital, retrieve critical medical supplies from the pharmacy, and return within 12 hours. What made the task nearly impossible was the intelligence gathered by Patterson's scouts. The hospital was overrun by a new type of infected that moved with terrifying speed and appeared to retain fragments of their human intelligence. Sarah Williams stood beside the tunnel's exit ladder, her injured arm now properly bandaged thanks to Elena's medical expertise, though the wound still throbbed with each movement. The leadership burden she'd carried since the high school had evolved into something deeper during their days in the tunnels. She'd spent hours studying the hospital's layout with Dr. Kane, memorizing every corridor, stairwell, and potential escape route. The weight of 17 lives rested on her shoulders, and she knew that failure would mean not just their expulsion, but likely their death sentences in a world where lone survivors rarely lasted more than days. Tommy Rodriguez had spent the previous night in the tunnel's makeshift electronics workshop, cobbling together communication devices from salvaged cell phones and radio parts. His technical skills, honed through years of urban exploration and amateur electronics, had become invaluable to their survival. The devices were crude but functional, allowing the team to maintain contact during their separation inside the hospital. As he distributed the communicators to each team member, his usual joking demeanor was replaced by grim determination. He'd volunteered for the most dangerous job, scouting ahead and identifying safe routes through the hospital's maze-like interior. Elena Vasquez carried the heaviest burden of all. Her medical knowledge made her essential for identifying which supplies were most critical for the tunnel community's survival, but it also meant she'd have to venture into the hospital's most dangerous areas. The pharmacy was located on the third floor, accessible only through corridors that the scouts reported were heavily infested with the new breed of infected. Her hands shook slightly as she reviewed the supply list Dr. Kane had prepared, knowing that each item on the paper represented lives that could be saved or lost based on her decisions in the coming hours. Jake Morrison had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all the survivors. The former quarterback's initial arrogance had been stripped away by weeks of life-or-death situations, replaced by a quiet competence that made him their most reliable fighter. He'd spent hours training with Colonel Patterson's soldiers, learning military tactics and hand-to-hand combat techniques that complemented his natural athletic ability. As the team's designated heavy weapons specialist, he carried a modified crowbar and a crossbow fashioned from salvaged materials, weapons that could eliminate threats silently without attracting additional infected. The ascent to street level revealed a city transformed by 3 weeks of abandonment. Millbrook General Hospital loomed against the gray morning sky like a monument to human civilization's collapse. Its windows were dark except for the occasional flicker of movement that suggested the infected within were still active. The parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned ambulances and cars, their doors hanging open like mechanical mouths frozen in silent screams. The team moved in practiced formation, using the vehicles as cover while they approached the hospital's main entrance. The first encounter with the new breed of infected shattered their assumptions about zombie behavior. These creatures, which Dr. Kane had theorized were runners, moved with coordination that defied everything they'd learned about the infection. When Tommy triggered a motion sensor near the hospital's loading dock, 3 of the creatures emerged from hiding spots with tactical precision, flanking the team's position while a 4th blocked their retreat route. The infected still bore the physical deterioration of the disease, pale skin, bloodshot eyes, and the telltale bite marks that marked their transformation, but their movements were fluid and purposeful rather than the shambling gait they'd grown accustomed to fighting. The battle was brief but terrifying. Jake's crossbow took down the first runner, but the creature's companions adapted immediately, using abandoned medical equipment as shields and weapons. Sarah's strategic mind worked frantically to process this new threat while Elena treated a deep scratch on Marcus's shoulder, the closest any of them had come to infection since leaving the high school. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the creature's speed or intelligence, but their apparent retention of muscle memory. One runner had instinctively operated a hospital elevator, while another had attempted to use a medical scanner as a weapon. As they finally breached the hospital's main entrance, the team realized they were facing an enemy that learned and adapted. The pharmaceutical supplies they desperately needed lay 3 floors above them, through corridors filled with an unknown number of these evolved infected. The mission had transformed from a simple supply run into a deadly game of cat and mouse, where their human intelligence was matched against creatures that retained enough humanity to be truly dangerous. The sound of coordinated footsteps echoing through the hospital's ventilation system suggested they were already being hunted. The return journey to the tunnel community carried an ominous weight that had nothing to do with the medical supplies strapped to their backs. Marcus pressed the bandage against his shoulder where the runner's claws had torn through his jacket, the wound throbbing with each step through the storm drain system. The hospital mission had been a Pyrrhic victory. They'd secured the desperately needed antibiotics and surgical supplies, but the encounter with the evolved infected had left them all shaken and questioning everything they thought they knew about survival in this new world. Sarah's tactical mind kept replaying the creature's coordinated attacks, searching for patterns that might help them prepare for future encounters. The first sign that something was wrong came from Tommy's modified radio, which crackled to life with frantic voices echoing through the tunnels ahead. Instead of the usual organized chatter of the tunnel community's communication network, they heard shouting, accusations, and what sounded like preparation for combat. Elena quickened her pace despite her exhaustion, her medical instincts recognizing the urgency in the distant voices. Jake moved protectively closer to the group, his crossbow ready and his eyes scanning the shadows for threats that might emerge from the branching passages. When they finally reached the main tunnel community, the scene that greeted them was chaos barely contained by Colonel Patterson's military discipline. The central gathering area had been transformed into an impromptu tribunal, with survivors divided into suspicious factions eyeing each other with barely concealed hostility. Dr. Kane stood at the center of the commotion, her face pale with exhaustion and fear as she clutched a folder of documents against her chest. Patterson's soldiers maintained order with visible effort, their weapons trained not on external threats but on their own community members. The revelation that shattered their fragile sense of security came from an unexpected source. Lisa Chin, a middle-aged accountant who had been one of the tunnel community's most trusted resource managers. Her confession poured out in a torrent of guilt and desperation as she admitted to secretly communicating with a group called the Reapers, providing them with detailed information about the tunnel community's defenses, supply routes, and most devastatingly, the identities of survivors who showed signs of natural immunity to the zombie infection. Her motivation wasn't malicious but terrifyingly practical. The Reapers had promised to protect her teenage daughter, who was being held in their fortified compound across the city. Vincent Cross, the Reapers' charismatic leader, represented everything the tunnel community had tried to avoid becoming. Through Lisa's intercepted communications, they learned that Cross preached a philosophy of survival through elimination. He believed that anyone who might be infected, even those showing natural immunity, represented an unacceptable risk to the remaining, pure human population. His followers, numbering in the hundreds, had been systematically hunting down and executing immune survivors across the region, viewing them as potential carriers who could spread new variants of the infection. The discovery of Marcus's potential immunity came through Dr. Kane's blood tests, conducted after his encounter with the runner at the hospital. The scratch that had seemed like a minor injury should have resulted in infection within hours, but Marcus showed no signs of the disease's progression. His blood work revealed antibodies that suggested natural resistance to the zombie pathogen, making him both invaluable to the community's survival and a target for the Reapers' genocidal campaign. The knowledge that his genetic makeup could be the key to understanding the infection also made him feel like a walking laboratory specimen. The tunnel community's debate over how to respond to the Reapers' threat revealed the fractures that had been developing beneath their united facade. Some survivors, led by a former police officer named Detective Ray Murphy, argued for surrendering the immune individuals to Cross in exchange for a non-aggression pact. Others, rallying behind Dr. Kane's scientific mission, insisted that the immune survivors represented humanity's best hope for developing a cure and should be protected at all costs. Colonel Patterson found himself caught between military pragmatism and moral obligation, knowing that a war with the Reapers would likely destroy both communities. Sarah's leadership skills were tested as never before when she was forced to choose between the safety of her original group and the welfare of the larger tunnel community. The immune survivors, Marcus, Elena, Jake, and surprisingly Tommy, faced the terrifying reality that their genetic gifts made them both saviors and outcasts. The community that had become their home was now debating whether to sacrifice them for the greater good, while an army of fanatics prepared to hunt them down for the crime of potentially carrying immunity. The part reached its climax when the tunnel's early warning system detected multiple breaches in their perimeter defenses. The Reapers had launched a coordinated assault on 3 separate entrances, using explosives and tactical precision that suggested military training. As alarms echoed through the passages and survivors scrambled to defensive positions, Marcus realized that Lisa's betrayal had provided their enemies with detailed knowledge of every weakness in their sanctuary. The battle for the tunnel community was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just their survival, but the fate of human evolution itself. The explosions that rocked the tunnel system sent shockwaves through concrete and steel, dislodging decades of accumulated debris and filling the air with choking dust. Marcus felt the reverberations in his bones as he pressed against the wall of Dr. Kane's makeshift laboratory, watching her frantically secure blood samples and research data while the battle raged in the tunnels beyond. The Reaper's assault had been more devastating than anyone anticipated. 3 simultaneous breaches had overwhelmed the tunnel community's defenses, forcing survivors to retreat deeper into the labyrinthine passages where the fighting had devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Dr. Kane's hands shook as she held up a vial of Marcus's blood, the crimson liquid seeming to glow under the emergency lighting. Her research over the past 72 hours had revealed something that changed everything they thought they knew about the infection and humanity's future. The immunity wasn't just resistance to the zombie pathogen, it was an evolutionary adaptation that allowed certain individuals to process and neutralize the parasitic organism before it could take hold. More incredibly, the antibodies produced by immune individuals could potentially be synthesized into a cure that would work on recently infected victims, provided treatment began within the first 6 hours of exposure. The moral weight of this discovery crushed down on Marcus as he realized that his blood, and the blood of the other immune survivors, could save thousands of lives. However, Dr. Kane's calculations were brutally clear. To produce enough synthesized antibodies to treat even a small group of infected individuals would require massive blood donations from the immune survivors, potentially fatal quantities that would drain them to the point of death. The cure that could save humanity might require the sacrifice of the very people who carried the genetic key to survival. Sarah Williams had found herself in an impossible position as the tunnel community's informal leader during Colonel Patterson's absence. The veteran soldier had led a counterattack against the Reaper's main assault force, leaving her to coordinate the defense of the laboratory section where the immune survivors had been gathered for protection. Her tactical mind worked overtime as she tried to balance the immediate threat of the Reapers with the long-term implications of Dr. Kane's research. Every decision she made could determine whether humanity would emerge from this apocalypse or succumb to both the infection and the fanaticism of those who claimed to be saving them. Tommy Rodriguez had discovered his own immunity through a terrifying accident during the Reaper's assault. When an explosive breach had trapped him in a collapsed section of tunnel with 2 infected survivors, he'd been bitten multiple times while trying to help them escape. The bites should have killed him within hours, but instead he'd experienced only mild flu-like symptoms before recovering completely. His technical skills, combined with his newfound immunity, made him invaluable for the dangerous task of retrieving research equipment from the compromised sections of the tunnel system. Elena Vasquez faced the most agonizing choice of all. Her medical training told her that volunteering for the maximum blood donation could save dozens of lives, but it would almost certainly kill her in the process. The other immune survivors, Marcus, Jake, and Tommy, were all grappling with the same terrible mathematics of survival. Each of them could potentially save lives by sacrificing their own, but their deaths would also eliminate the genetic diversity that might be crucial for developing more effective treatments in the future. The battle in the tunnels had reached a stalemate, with both sides suffering heavy casualties while the zombie hordes, attracted by the noise and chaos, began infiltrating the compromised sections of the tunnel system. The Reapers found themselves fighting a two-front war as the very creatures they claimed to be protecting humanity from began overwhelming their assault teams. Vincent Cross's fanatical followers discovered that their ideology offered little protection against the claws and teeth of the infected, and many began questioning whether their leader's vision of purity was worth dying for. Jake Morrison had embraced his role as the immune survivor's protector, using his athletic abilities and combat training to guard the laboratory while Dr. Kane worked frantically to complete her research. His transformation from selfish teenager to selfless guardian was complete, but the knowledge that he might need to sacrifice his life to save others weighed heavily on his mind. The crossbow in his hands had become an extension of his will to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even as he wondered if he would live to see the world that their sacrifice might create. As the sounds of battle drew closer to the laboratory, Dr. Kane made a desperate announcement that changed everything. She had discovered a way to synthesize the antibodies using a combination of immune blood and samples from the original government experiment, requiring smaller donations that wouldn't kill the donors. However, the process would take time they didn't have, and it would require accessing the CDC facility where the original Project Lazarus research had been conducted. The immune survivors faced a choice between certain death defending the tunnels or uncertain survival attempting to reach the facility through a city overrun by both zombies and fanatics. The decision to split the tunnel community tore at Marcus's heart as he watched familiar faces choosing between 2 equally desperate paths. Colonel Patterson had returned from his counterattack bloodied but unbroken, his military bearing intact despite the devastating losses his team had suffered. The veteran soldier's tactical assessment was brutally honest. The tunnel system was compromised beyond repair, with multiple breaches allowing both Reapers and zombies to infiltrate their sanctuary. Half the community would stay to mount a final defense, buying time for the immune survivors and Dr. Kane to escape toward the CDC facility, while the other half would scatter through the storm drain system in small groups, hoping to find safety in numbers too small to attract attention. Sarah Williams stood at the center of the chaos, her voice cutting through the din of preparation as she coordinated the most complex evacuation the survivors had ever attempted. Her leadership had evolved from desperate improvisation to confident command, but the weight of choosing who would stay and who would go threatened to crush her resolve. The immune survivors, Marcus, Elena, Jake, and Tommy, were non-negotiable evacuees, their genetic gifts too valuable to risk in the final battle. However, each of them had formed bonds with the tunnel community that made leaving feel like abandonment of the highest order. The laboratory section had become a fortress within a fortress, with Dr. Kane working frantically to pack her research while survivors erected barricades from medical equipment and furniture. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she secured blood samples and research notes that represented months of desperate work. The synthesized antibody formula was incomplete, but the theoretical framework was sound. If they could reach the CDC facility and access the original Project Lazarus data, they might be able to complete the cure that could save not just their small group, but potentially thousands of other survivors scattered across the country. Elena Vasquez had volunteered to remain behind, her medical skills desperately needed for the wounded defenders, but Marcus refused to allow her sacrifice. The argument that erupted between them revealed the depth of their friendship and the impossible choices that survival demanded. Elena's training told her that staying meant certain death, but leaving meant abandoning people who needed her help. The compromise came when she agreed to evacuate while training 2 other survivors in emergency medical procedures, passing on knowledge that might keep people alive in her absence. Tommy Rodriguez had rigged the tunnel's electrical system with improvised explosive devices, creating a deadly maze that would channel both Reapers and zombies into predetermined kill zones. His technical expertise, combined with his newfound immunity, made him invaluable for the dangerous task of setting timed charges that would collapse sections of the tunnel system after the evacuation was complete. The explosives were crude but effective, fashioned from cleaning supplies and electronics salvaged from the tunnel's workshop areas. Jake Morrison's transformation was most evident in his willingness to lead the rearguard action that would protect the evacuating survivors. The former quarterback had become the tunnel community's most skilled fighter, his athletic abilities enhanced by weeks of combat training under Colonel Patterson's guidance. His crossbow had been supplemented with a modified riot shield and tactical vest, making him look like a medieval knight prepared for modern warfare. The knowledge that he might not survive the evacuation weighed on him, but his determination to protect the others had become the driving force of his existence. The battle erupted with terrifying intensity as 3 separate forces converged on the laboratory section. Vincent Cross's Reapers had breached the tunnel's secondary defenses, their fanatical determination driving them forward despite heavy casualties. The zombie horde, drawn by the explosions and gunfire, had infiltrated through the collapsed sections, their numbers swelling as the noise attracted more infected from the surface. The tunnel community's defenders found themselves fighting a desperate 3-way battle, with enemies approaching from multiple directions while trying to protect the escaping immune survivors. Colonel Patterson's sacrifice came as the evacuation reached its most critical phase. The veteran soldier had positioned himself at the tunnel's main junction, using his military training and a cache of explosive devices to hold off a combined assault from both Reapers and zombies. His final radio transmission was calm and professional, reporting that the evacuation route was clear and that the charges were armed. The explosion that followed collapsed nearly 50 meters of tunnel, sealing off the laboratory section but trapping Patterson and a dozen volunteers in a tomb of concrete and steel. The escape route led through the city's storm water system, a maze of pipes and channels that Tommy had mapped during his exploration of the tunnel network. The immune survivors and Dr. Kane crawled through spaces barely wide enough for human passage, their progress marked by the distant sounds of battle echoing through the concrete passages. Behind them, the tunnel community's final stand continued, buying them precious minutes with blood and courage. Ahead lay the CDC facility, 20 miles away through a city overrun with zombies and patrolled by Reaper hunting parties, but carrying within it the potential for humanity's salvation. The abandoned CDC facility emerged from the morning mist like a monument to humanity's lost ambitions, its sterile glass and concrete structure standing intact while the city around it had crumbled into chaos. Marcus pressed himself against the perimeter fence, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air as he studied the building through Tommy's improvised binoculars. 3 days of travel through the storm drain system had brought them 20 miles from the tunnel community, but the journey had cost them dearly. 2 of Dr. Kane's research assistants had been lost to a Reaper patrol, and their remaining supplies were dangerously low. Dr. Kane's hands trembled as she examined the facility's external security systems, recognizing equipment and protocols from her years working within the government's biodefense programs. The building showed signs of recent occupation. Solar panels had been installed on the roof, windows on the upper floors glowed with artificial light, and most tellingly, the main entrance bore fresh modifications that suggested someone had been maintaining the facility's operations. Her scientific instincts told her that finding other researchers could be invaluable for completing the cure, but her survival experience warned that anyone still operating in this location might not be friendly to unexpected visitors. The infiltration began at dawn, with Tommy using his urban exploration skills to identify a maintenance access that bypassed the facility's main security checkpoints. The building's interior was a jarring contrast to the devastation they'd witnessed throughout the city: clean corridors lined with functioning equipment, laboratories that hummed with activity, and most disturbing of all, the sounds of human voices engaged in what seemed to be normal scientific discourse. Sarah's tactical mind immediately recognized that they were walking into a potentially hostile environment where their immunity might make them valuable test subjects rather than allies. The discovery of Dr. Marcus Webb's research operation shattered their assumptions about finding salvation at the CDC facility. Webb, a former colleague of Dr. Kane's from the original Project Lazarus team, had continued the government's experiments using human subjects captured from the surrounding area. His laboratory contained dozens of containment cells housing both zombies and immune survivors, all being subjected to various experimental procedures designed to understand and potentially weaponize the infection. The clinical detachment with which Webb's team conducted their research was more terrifying than the zombies themselves. These were humans who had abandoned their humanity in pursuit of scientific advancement. Elena Vasquez's medical training allowed her to quickly assess the condition of the imprisoned survivors, many of whom showed signs of prolonged experimentation and psychological trauma. The ethical horror of what she witnessed challenged everything she believed about the medical profession's commitment to helping people. Among the test subjects, she recognized several faces from other survivor communities they'd encountered during their journey, including Lisa Chen's teenage daughter, the girl whose safety had motivated the tunnel community's betrayal. The realization that the Reapers had been trading captured immune survivors to Webb's team in exchange for weapons and supplies added another layer of betrayal to their already complex moral landscape. Jake Morrison's combat skills were tested when the rescue mission triggered the facility's security protocols. Webb's guards weren't ordinary survivors fighting for their lives. They were trained professionals who viewed the immune survivors as valuable research assets to be captured rather than threats to be eliminated. The fighting was unlike anything they'd experienced, requiring stealth and precision rather than the desperate brutality of their previous encounters. Jake's athletic ability allowed him to navigate the facility's complex layout while avoiding security cameras and motion sensors, but the psychological pressure of fighting humans rather than zombies added a new dimension to their survival challenges. Tommy Rodriguez discovered that Webb's research had produced disturbing insights into the infection's true nature. The zombie pathogen wasn't simply a parasitic organism. It was a sophisticated biological weapon that could be modified and controlled under laboratory conditions. Webb's team had successfully created variants that targeted specific genetic markers, potentially allowing them to selectively infect populations while leaving others immune. The implications were staggering. The infection could be turned into a tool for genocide, eliminating entire ethnic groups or social classes while preserving those deemed genetically superior. Dr. Kane's confrontation with her former colleague revealed the philosophical divide that had split the scientific community since the outbreak began. Webb argued that extreme measures were justified by the species-level threat posed by the infection, while Kane maintained that their humanity was worth preserving even in the face of extinction. The debate took place in a laboratory surrounded by the evidence of Webb's crimes: caged humans reduced to test subjects, experimental zombies engineered for specific purposes, and research data purchased with suffering and death. The part reached its climax when the rescue mission was complicated by the discovery that some of the imprisoned survivors had volunteered for Webb's experiments, believing that the research was necessary for humanity's survival. These willing participants, driven to desperation by months of struggling against the infection, had traded their freedom for the promise of contributing to a cure. The moral complexity of their situation forced Marcus and his friends to question whether their own quest for a cure justified the methods they were willing to employ, and whether salvation achieved through such means was worth having at all. The final confrontation began with the earth-shaking roar of thousands of infected voices unified in a terrifying chorus that echoed across the CDC facility's grounds. Marcus stood at the laboratory window, watching in horror as the largest zombie horde he'd ever seen emerge from the city's ruins, their movements coordinated by a figure that defied everything they thought they knew about the infection. The controller, as Dr. Kane had named it, stood nearly 8 feet tall at the center of the mass, its partially decayed form still recognizably human but enhanced with an intelligence that made it more terrifying than any mindless corpse. Sarah Williams had never faced a tactical challenge of this magnitude, 3 distinct forces converging on their position with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. Vincent Cross's Reapers approached from the east, their fanatical determination driving them forward despite the zombie threat they claimed to be fighting against. Dr. Webb's security forces held the facility's interior, torn between protecting their research and evacuating their human test subjects. The zombie horde, guided by the controller's malevolent intelligence, surrounded the entire complex with a precision that suggested military strategy retained from its human life. The alliance that formed in the facility's main laboratory was born of desperation rather than trust. Dr. Kane worked frantically alongside her former colleague Dr. Webb, their scientific rivalry set aside in the face of extinction. The cure formula was nearly complete, requiring only the specific protein sequences found in the original Project Lazarus research data. However, the controller's coordinated assault had damaged the facility's power grid, leaving them with limited time before the laboratory's containment systems failed and released dozens of experimental zombies into the building. Elena Vasquez found herself performing emergency surgery on Vincent Cross himself after the Reaper leader was severely injured during his assault on the facility's main entrance. The irony wasn't lost on her, saving the life of a man who had dedicated himself to hunting down people like her. Cross's fanatical beliefs wavered as Elena's medical skills kept him alive, forcing him to confront the reality that the immune survivors he'd been trying to eliminate were the very people capable of saving humanity. His followers, witnessing their leader's dependence on an immune survivor's help, began questioning the ideology that had driven them to commit atrocities. Tommy Rodriguez's technical expertise became crucial when Dr. Kane discovered that broadcasting the cure formula to other survivor settlements required a transmission array powerful enough to reach across the continent. The facility's communication equipment had been damaged during the initial assault, but Tommy's knowledge of electronics and improvised engineering allowed him to jury-rig a solution using the building's emergency broadcast system. The process would require enormous amounts of power, potentially draining the facility's backup generators and leaving them defenseless against the approaching threats. Jake Morrison led the defense of the laboratory section, coordinating between former enemies who found themselves fighting side by side for survival. Reapers who had been hunting immune survivors now protected them from zombie attacks, while Dr. Webb's security personnel shared weapons and tactical information with the people they'd been experimenting on just hours before. The battles were brutal and desperate, with each group bringing their unique skills to bear against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The controller's true horror was revealed when it began speaking, its voice carrying across the facility's public address system in fragments of human language mixed with inhuman sounds. Dr. Kane realized that this creature retained not just intelligence but memories from its human life. It had been a military strategist, explaining its ability to coordinate the zombie horde with tactical precision. The revelation that some infected individuals could retain their personalities while gaining control over other zombies opened terrifying possibilities about the infection's ultimate potential. Marcus faced the most crucial decision of his life when Dr. Kane's completed cure formula required a massive blood donation to power the transmission device that would broadcast the cure to other settlements worldwide. His immune blood, processed through the facility's synthesizing equipment, could create enough antibodies to treat thousands of infected individuals, but the procedure would almost certainly kill him. The choice between personal survival and humanity's future became the defining moment of his transformation from frightened teenager to humanity's savior. The climactic battle saw the controller leading its horde in a final assault on the laboratory while the cure transmission began. Tommy's improvised broadcast array worked perfectly, sending the cure formula to receiver stations across North America and beyond. The defeat of the controller came through teamwork that would have been impossible weeks earlier. Vincent Cross used his knowledge of Reaper tactics, Dr. Webb contributed his understanding of zombie biology, and the immune survivors provided the courage to face an enemy that represented their worst nightmares. The story concluded 6 months later, with Marcus standing on the observation deck of a rebuilt settlement watching zombie-free zones expand across a digital map. The cure had worked, transforming the global nightmare into a manageable crisis. The settlement housed former Reapers working alongside immune survivors, scientists collaborating on rebuilding projects, and most importantly, children playing in areas that had once been overrun with the undead. The dawn of their new world had risen from the ashes of the old, built on the foundation of cooperation forged in humanity's darkest hour.